Our next speaker is Christopher Fennell. He is an anthropologist specializing in historical archaeology. He's a professor of anthropology and law at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. Chris holds a PhD from the University of Virginia and a JD from Georgetown. His research projects address aspects of African diaspora heritage and dynamics of social group affiliations among African Americans and European Americans in the 18th and 19th centuries. Fennell is the founding editor of the Journal of African Diaspora Archaeology and Heritage, publisher and past editor of the African Diaspora Archaeology newsletter, member of the editorial board of the International Journal of Historical Archaeology. He does a lot of work with journals. And past member of the board of directors of the Society for Historical Archaeology, and also president of the Illinois Archaeological Survey. His work in African diaspora research has been recognized by several awards, including the 2009 John L. Cotter Award by the Society of Historical Archaeology. Fennell also serves as a visiting professor of law at the University of Chicago Law School, teaching courses on the intersections of racism, law, and the social sciences. So please join me in welcoming Chris to the podium.
Thank you so much for that very generous introduction. We all just want to sit down after you have that introduction and say, we'll stand on that. I don't want to diminish this in any way. I'm here as just one spokesman of just an enormous collaborative endeavor going back frighteningly now 20 years or almost to the early starts of it. As you can see, it's been a whole cluster of universities, the State Museum and their research agency in Illinois, a whole variety of consultants. We've approached this site, which is a town site out, is just rural Illinois and western Illinois that starts as a town in 1836 and then dissipates in the 1880s as a town, and later communities carry on in that area. But over the 20 years, we've also approached it as a kind of a methodological laboratory to learn all the more we can. So you see quite a lot of names of specialists who do LIDAR and aerial thermal and all sorts of things with it. The historical distinction of New Philadelphia is that it is the first town in the United States that was planned in advance and legally registered by African Americans. So you've heard about all these other communities that people come together and organically create a neighborhood or a community. So the distinction here is one of looking at the court records and this sort of planning in advance and setting this out. And it was Frank and Lucy McWhorter who come up from stepwise from South Carolina and Kentucky and moved to Western Illinois, and realizing the theme of their life, which is a theme that you've heard pervading many of these stories, is first freedom, and then also for them in achieving freedom for their extended family in developing the community was education and religion, and very much facilitating those. So the story for Frank McWhorter, that's a short talk, sorry, went the wrong way. The story we know begins, Frank McWhorter's mother Judah is born somewhere in West Africa, abducted into the slave trade in the mid-1700s. She survives the horrors of the Middle Passage, finds herself in Charleston on a slave sales dock where George McWhorter, a Scots-Irish person, purchases her and takes her to the backcountry of South Carolina where he has a very large plantation. In 1777, her son Frank is born on that plantation. And as you move forward, we have just a little bits of shreds of evidence of their history. But when Frank is a young man in the 1800s or so, George McWhorter, the Scots-Irishman, who was both the owner of the plantation and we're quite certain Frank's father, wants to move to Kentucky. He's bought more land, getting cheaper prices, so he's moving the whole operation to Kentucky, and at this time, Judah's name does not reappear, so she had probably lived out her life in South Carolina. Frank, as a young man, moves with George McWhorter. He is one of his enslaved laborers to this new space in Kentucky. While there, Frank meets Lucy, who is an enslaved laborer in a neighboring plantation. They marry and start raising a family. They have 4 children while they are enslaved. And throughout this time period, one of the other themes you've heard through a lot of these stories that is just extraordinary for the McWhorters is an incredible tenacity, determination, industriousness. Throughout time, they're looking for constant ways to build credits, to get the wealth by which they can first purchase their own freedom, and then the freedom of their family members. So finally, in 1817, there in the neighboring plantations in Kentucky, they purchased Lucy's freedom, and it was a very smart time to do it because she was pregnant with their 5th child. So the 5th child was born into freedom, and the children after that. 2 years later, they purchased Frank's freedom, and now they live on as a free couple in Kentucky. And Frank and Lucy are just doing everything they can to raise credits and funds to purchase. They have 4 children born into slavery who become young adults, who have their children. The short end of the accounting for this is that in their lifetimes, they will purchase 16 people out of slavery for a cash outlay today that would be in excess of $300,000. It's just a staggering accomplishment. And in Kentucky, they're doing things like going and mining saltpeter in caves. In the early 1800s, there was a great demand for saltpeter because it's part of black powder, and the United States was trying to produce its own black powder and its own armaments. So you have them plugging into a piece of that commodity chain in a cave in Kentucky to get more proceeds to buy more of their children and grandchildren out of slavery. And as they're doing that and accumulating what they can, you also had, after the War of 1812, that the southern half of what is now the state of Illinois was designated as the military bounty lands. So you begin to move to the second star here. Let me show you the military bounty lands. So this was when Illinois becomes a state in 1818. It was a territory of the United States before that, and they set aside an area of this that was charted out in 1-mile sections, that if you were a veteran of the War of 1812 or the Revolutionary War, you could get a 1-mile section at a very low price, very good credit ratings. That starts in the 18-teens, then it's opened up to broad sales, so that by the time you come into the 1820s, someone who has purchased 160 acres, a quarter of one of those 1-mile sections, where that dot, in the area of where that red dot that becomes New Philadelphia is, comes to Kentucky, meets Frank McWhorter and says, I have a 160-acre tract. I hear you've got some good enterprises going here, including this mining. And he, sight unseen, but having heard about the promise of this area and its fertility. Illinois has just tremendous fertility throughout most of the agricultural lands. He trades interests and credits to get that 160 acres in the late 1820s, and then moves his free family. 4 of them have to remain behind, but moves his free family out there 1830 to 1831. And the area that he will call New Philadelphia, you see in an aerial photo up there in the top right with the boundaries to it, that's 42 acres. His 160 acres is immediately to the top of that. So he arrives in 1831, and he's just immediately becomes an incredibly productive entrepreneur. He's raising livestock, raising surplus crops, engaging with the surrounding mostly European American farmers, but there's also some other incredibly accomplished individuals. You'll see a name later of John Walker. John Walker has almost a parallel story of buying his family out of slavery in Georgia and moving stepwise out to the promise of this new agricultural area and also real estate area, as it turns out. So while he's there in the early 1830s, he realizes that a way to get more money faster is that instead of selling land as agricultural parcels, if you can turn it into the promise of a town and you're now selling urban lots, you get more per acre. And so he hires a surveyor to plot out a map, and he purchases an 80-acre parcel to the south of his farmstead, subdivides it, and the surveyors advise 42 acres will work quite well. This is a later map that shows you what the plat would look like, and he refers to it initially as Philadelphia. So this is filed in the courthouse and makes legal history for African Americans planning in advance to take a raw prairie, turn it into a map of what will be lots, streets, back alleys, and the like, and filing that under one of the state legal systems. And you can see here the area is outlined in various maps. We have no photographs of Frank McWhorter, but we have photographs of his adult sons. And this is just been an incredibly rich collaborative experience that the descendant families of the African-American families who lived in Philadelphia, of the McWhorters who founded it and also lived within the town itself, are incredibly accomplished individuals. One is Abdullah Kalamat, who is one of the leading scholars in Black studies today. So talk about having a very rich collaboration of how do we think about this, what are the questions we ask. They're not only speaking in terms of their idea as descendants and as family members, but as incredibly invested intellectuals. One of his cousins is an accomplished sculptor. She took photographs of the adult sons and created this sculpture of her interpretation of what Frank probably looked like. And you'll find versions of this in a variety of museums these days. I think I have a slide to show you later. One of the things that we're working on now is getting the story of this incredible family, these varieties of families that were in this area, out to the broadest audience possible. And you can now see this story in the National Museum of American History on the Mall in Washington, D.C. And that's a very proud moment to take one of these stories from being somewhat in obscurity, decades ago, and now it's something that everyone is seeing in very prominent places, and particularly younger generations. We're also trying to get as much of this into primary school books teaching American history. It shouldn't just be in limited publication venues. So that's Frank, some of the group in the area. Now, as the town grows, this is his original plot and then the 80 acres that he subdivides. This is the plat designating what it will look like that's filed in the courthouse in 1836. This is just another rendering of it to show you he was thinking big. The main streets are 60 feet wide to 80 feet wide, so he was really thinking a commercial hub with a lot of traffic. And we think at least the north central portion of it really developed that way. As it grows, we are looking at in the project and thinking about it, as you've heard in a number of the other studies, of the different versions of racism as adversity that these families are constantly working to overcome. And one of the interesting facets of the history of this town is that it is surrounded by overt racial strife, just violence, killings in the 1830s and 1840s. But we have no record of overt racial violence within the town itself. Some of the local community members at times get a little enthusiastic about this, and they want to have roadsides saying, "Come see New Philadelphia, a place of racial harmony in the 19th century." But most of us, including the descendants of the McWhorter family, would say the word racial harmony just doesn't work very well in this time, this place. You can ask the question of whether it's working very well for us right now with current political rhetoric flying about. So we've looked at a variety of the nuance. You've heard in the other studies of there's overt racial violence, and you can think of how that type of ideology plays out. But one of the things we would see more as a challenge within New Philadelphia is we knew we were in the context of being surrounded by overt acts, but the impacts on this town were going to be much more at a systemic and structural level. And that's an incredibly challenging thing to really tease out in any detail for historians and archaeologists. And the primary way in which that played out here is the end of the town as a town. It's succeeded by a smaller community. But I'll describe that in a moment as to a systemic racial impact that brings it to an end as a town. Here's just a map to give you an idea of it. 1836, he files that plat in the courthouse. 1837, in Alton, Elijah Lovejoy, an abolitionist, is shot dead at the doorstep of his abolitionist press, and the press burned to the ground. Jacksonville, in contrast, is a stronghold of houses that are serving people escaping in what we often call the Underground Railroad. Quincy is also an abolitionist center, and very ardent abolitionists are crossing the Mississippi River into slave state Missouri across the Mississippi to help people escape, and with reports of gunfire and gunfights across the river in the 1830s, 40s, and this time period. Hannibal is an active market for selling enslaved laborers, right up through, the final conclusion of emancipation in the Civil War. So you can see New Philadelphia is right in the middle of this whole region torn by very overt racial strife, and yet develops as a town very openly founded by a free African American and very open to bringing more free African Americans to come live there. And that would be fairly controversial at this more structural level in this time period. So as it develops, the quick sort of statistics is, so 1836 is the plat. We found the first building archaeologically, 1840, the first house being built within the town. It's this 42-acre potential grid. The way that it developed out, it didn't follow the grid with everyone filling out all those spaces. All the spaces were bought and sold over the decades of the town being a town, but basically everyone settled in the north central portion of it, where that current railroad or road you see was actually a dirt road that existed at the time. So Frank McWhorter just had Frank and Lucy, incredible fortune and sagacity that when they come and they arrive to their farmstead, there's a cross-county dirt road running at the base of their farmstead that takes you to the Mississippi 25 miles one way and the Illinois 15 miles the other way. And people are in constant motion. They're wagoning and pushing livestock to go to the rivers, put them on barges, and work in the merchant connections. So when he establishes a town, he establishes it right across that dirt road. And as the town develops, people tend to cluster up in the north-central side along that corridor. So not all of the 42 acres was developed, but we find first house 1840. It reaches its peak around 1865 with 160 people, 29 households, a whole dozen or more commercial enterprises. There's a blacksmith, a wainwright, a cabinet maker. There's a physician in town. There's a preacher in town, although they don't succeed in building a church. Just a whole, think of like an agricultural service community like you'd almost see in old films. And this is the place you could stop in and get your wagon fixed, purchase some goods. There's a dry goods store, a real crossroads hub. So it reaches its peak in population 1865. And then in 1869, a new railroad is built that bypasses it. You see fairly dramatically in the documentary record, and we also see it in the archaeological record. First businesses start to move away, then residences start to move away. And by the time of 1885, when you go back to the courthouse, that plat has been rewritten and said this is now being vacated as a town and is being reverted to being just broad agricultural parcels. So in the court records, it would be 1885 would be the time when they say this is really no longer a functional town. Now, farmsteads read on it, they take up the space, bar away, remove all the structures, return it to large agricultural plots. So as you move into the 1930s, you've got 3 farms reading on the space of what was once this vibrant town. So that's very much part of the story that you hear in a number of these studies of this incredible industry bringing together social networking to work in entrepreneurship, but then a variety of pressures leading to the demise of it as a community or a town, and then an ongoing fight to have recognition of its existence or to preserve it if you have some degree of preservation. As it developed, we can tell we have a tremendous amount of documentary records. I mean, just a mountain. This was a 20-year project, so we've got tax records, census records, and we can level those all up and have a sense as we move from block to block what the ethnic affiliation in the census records would be for the family that lived in that lot in a particular time, where they categorize as European American or African American. But none of that would tell us if there was segregation within the town itself. You could have these lots and people could just self-segregate and stay away from one another within the town, and we couldn't tell that from the documents. But 20 years of archaeology tell us this was a fully socially integrated town. The families were completely interspersed, the businesses were completely interspersed. This really did have that sort of social integration that the locals like to think this is a place of racial harmony that we really need to tout to everyone, that if they could do it then, why can't we do it now? Why can't we move past all these issues of racism? It was segregated in 2 ways. One, education, and it was segregated in education because Illinois did not provide for the education of African Americans. And the McWhorters, being the McWhorters, said, well, screw you people, we're going to make our own school. So they created their own school for the African American children that was operative throughout the time period. In 1874, finally, Illinois starts providing broader education and a new schoolhouse was built. But up until then, you had 2 schoolhouses serving the community. It was also segregated in the cemeteries, so that there was an early cemetery for the McWhorter family, and a lot of the other African American families tended to bury their deceased there, whereas the European Americans were burying at another nearby cemetery. And that's still a subject we're looking at as to the exact sort of path dynamics of how that segregation of the cemeteries occurred. So this is, we just have a tremendous amount of data. This had just field schools and NSF funding, a wonderful story of a very broad collaborative project and all of the findings generated from it. Here's some quick summaries of it. One, it was a fully socially integrated community. They were not spatially segregated within the town. The material culture from household to household looked very similar. So we don't see a different pattern of material culture in African American associated houses versus European American. We do see a difference in the dietary pattern. Most of the African Americans came from the southeast of the United States, and there's a culinary system there that's often called the Upland South culinary pattern, which is using much more pork, fresh game. It's much more diversified. By chance, that was a regional pattern at the time that they were moving, but by chance, African American families come from that area. The European Americans are coming from the Northeast and the Great Lakes, and the regional pattern there looks different. So regional patterns begin to look ethnic if you're walking around the dining rooms of New Philadelphia. It's a very interesting sort of cycling of the way things are working. Mix of agricultural styles, all the styles you've seen in these other studies. They had frame, they had log, it was not patterned in any particular way. All of them had immediate access to international and national markets. Same thing that you see of Staffordshire in mixed matched sets, or no matched sets, but all households were plugged into international markets for ceramics, house goods, and the like from the outset, 1840 on. And so the main sort of pattern we can see as to African American versus European American is in the foodways, and people will often tell you that it's for the sort of conservative care of foodways. For us, I think it's more an effect of where the families were coming from, and you're seeing regional patterns impacting this small integrated community. So the structural impact on this that comes in the end is that in the late 1850s, a business based in Hannibal, where they have an active slave market, wants to build a railway that's going to connect an enormous network that's going east from the east edge of the county and another network that's going off to the west. They just need to connect those two, and then Hannibal is going to be this incredible commercial node. So a group of business people in Hannibal, 1857, looking out their window at an active slave market in Hannibal itself, are the ones who are pushing this thing to have across the river in Pike County, Illinois, this railroad built. So they hire a surveyor, and the surveyor initially comes in, and this took years. One of the methodological challenges here, it takes years to scour and find the evidence to make an argument that I'm about to tell you in like two second summary, to do it convincingly, because there's so many other ways you could hypothesize what happened. But we finally got the records of the actual company itself in handwritten ledgers, and looked at every other source possible. But initially the idea was just come straight in a straight line. It's the efficient way to do a short distance, connect these up, and the professional surveyors submit that to the company in Hannibal, and they say, that was very nice, but rethink that. When you get to, you can see New Salem to the right of the diamond where New Philadelphia is, and then you see Cool Bank or Barry, those others. It basically says, when you get to New Salem, think about going north. And give us a new survey. So when I'm saying survey, they're actually giving the grading. This is how you're going to build the thing. And so they do that, and they bring back a new one, say, okay, if you want to go north, we can go north. And so the final direction was going to be this big arc that goes up and around New Philadelphia, comes back level with New Philadelphia, and then continues on that straight line. And you can, in Q&A, we can talk more if you're interested in this. But after years of looking at this and testing every hypothesis, the only standing hypothesis for this is their own racial animus, that they did not want to see New Philadelphia thrive as a depot town. It had been around for a decade or more. Frank's founding of it was very open. He had an active Illinois, the amazing resourcefulness of this. He had an active Illinois legislature passed to register his name in 1836, give him all the rights and responsibilities of a white person in court, so that when he filed that 1836 plat, no white guy could come and steal it. And under the Illinois law, if he didn't have that, a white guy could say, no, that's my land, and he couldn't even testify against them in court. So he's very audacious, or very open in the way he's doing this. There's a broad public record. Everyone in the area knows about it. And so our best explanation is these business people in Hannibal did not want to see this town thrive. And they spent, I really emphasize to people who have a sort of an economic perspective, they only lost money in doing this. It wasn't the sort of thing that perpetrators were harvesting money to themselves. This racial ideology was so distorted that all the perpetrators of this lost tangible wealth down the line. The railroad gets operating in 1870, and by 1880, the successor railroad is moving it down. They're getting rid of that arc because it's costing them too much money to keep moving the trains in that direction. And unfortunately, by the time they build it out into the turn of the century, New Philadelphia is just agricultural fields. The impact has happened. People have moved on. So that's the type of perspective I often bring as a European American heritage researcher, is I'm looking at what are the bad things the white guys did. And it's wonderful in this collaborative project that I have the descendant community, and particularly people like Abdul Al-Kalaman, who says, that's really a dull, stupid question. I mean, how many episodes do we need to know how white people did really stupid, racist things in the past? That's a big list. What I want to know is, what did the families do to overcome these adversities? The McWhorters in particular are incredibly resourceful. Solomon McWhorter is Frank's son. He too is an amazingly accomplished agricultural entrepreneur running hundreds of heads of cattle, several hundred acres of crops. So he immediately uses the railway to his own purposes, shipping out his cattle for great profit. And then also it's when people leave, the ongoing portion of this that we may be doing in New Philadelphia is to follow all those families. Where do they next go? What are the next opportunities that they pursue? And I want to wrap up just by talking about trying to get the story of New Philadelphia out. It's really an amazing accomplishment of these families and all of the avenues they use to resist the structural as well as overt problems. This is what it looks like today. There are cemeteries, the town site and the like. There's currently legislation pending to try to turn New Philadelphia into a unit of the National Park Service. So we're moving forward on that, but this is Abdul Al-Kalamat I've mentioned in a talk. But very much looking practically of how to connect this to have people come to the site, learn these stories, and stand in those spaces that the McWhorters and others inhabited. And for Seneca Village, I was just had a great time looking at the signage. Here's what's currently going at it. We have a brief set of typical signage at the site, but we're making use of augmented reality. Has been done fairly nicely in a first generation go, and the consultant doing this is working on a second generation. So you go to these posts, and instead of it being the whole sign, it will give you a quick scan, and you can hold up your device and it'll give you a representation of the building, but also you can punch on things and it'll give you someone's interview of what they know about the building, the oral histories, the artifacts. We'll give you the archaeological drawings, everything we can contribute from all these lines of evidence. And this is in the middle of nowhere, Illinois. So one of the things you have to think about if you do this in Seneca is you have to hang a wireless feed there, because you can't make people burn their own data plans for this. This is a big data dump. So we actually have a wireless feed in these fields out in the middle of nowhere, contributed by a local electric company. So as you go, you can flip on your Wi-Fi and download anything you want to know as you stand at the exact site, because we backfill everything to protect the archaeological site. So these are some of the renditions in the first edition of what you would see if you hold up your thing. There's a grocery store, there's someone doing the blacksmith shop and the like. But also this is a small portion of what you'll find on the National Mall today. And the other thing is we're pretty relentlessly trying, anytime we get a lead of having an influence on a primary American history textbook that's going to either be in a high school or in a introductory course in college, is we want a page. We want the New Philadelphia McWhorter story on it. Particularly in Illinois, we want, you'll see Abe here and you'll see Frank and Lucy there. That's the way it's got to be as far as we're concerned. And we've been very successful, particularly Abdul Al-Kalamat is very well networked for trying to get this done. So that second phase of getting the word out, I think, is really fundamental, and we've been very gratified in the progress we've had. And I thank you for your time.